There is a dance that we do when someone dies. Ministers learn the steps to this dance pretty early on in our careers. Whether the death is sudden or if it's a long expected death, there is immediately afterwards a meeting with the family. There's a trip to the funeral home to plan the visitation and the service. Then things shift into high gear for the preacher. You have to plan the music for the service, contact musicians, write a eulogy, prepare a liturgy, and then sort of ride the current of events from visitation to the service. There is most often, following the service, a processional to the graveyard and an interment. The graveside service is usually pretty brief, and when it's done, people awkwardly linger, milling about, talking and trying to find a way to politely end it and leave. What comes next in almost every event is a meal. Now, I'm clearly a man who's never been afraid to eat. But if ever there was a time that I could skip a meal, it's then. Sadness, grief, the rituals of death just don't gin up much of an appetite for me. But the preacher is expected to be there, to say the blessing and to be available to anyone that might want to talk about what has happened, which in my experience is precisely 0 people, because nobody wants to think about it anymore. Nobody wants to talk about it. But the conversation that does often seem to take place during that meal is one that I would love to miss. It's the who gets what conversation. An old gentleman in my student parish passed away without any children of his own, so his estate was to be divided among his several nieces and nephews. The financial part, the big stuff, the house, his bank accounts, they were all dealt with through the will, but he had left this big house full of valuable antiques and artwork that were to be divided amicably among the family. There I was, with a glass of iced tea between my feet and a paper plate precariously balanced on my knees, and the niece sitting to my immediate right reached into her purse and pulled out several copies of a list of the things that she wanted from Uncle's house and passed them around to all of her blood kin, which in that terrible moment became her group of competitors. The list evidently named virtually everything of value that Uncle John ever owned. Now, my master's and doctorate in pastoral counseling did not prepare me to deal with the conversation that ensued, which luckily for me didn't take the turn of the conversation that we just heard read from Luke chapter 12, when a man turns to Jesus and asks him to arbitrate the division of their estate. That incident was about 30 years ago, and I'm guessing that right up until today, that is the only time in my life that I surrendered an entire plate full of fried chicken and just headed for the door to slip away. We don't know much about the historical Jesus, not really, and anything that we're fairly confident about could be wrong. But of the things that scholars tend to think probably did come from the actual historical Jesus, what's in the canonical Gospels, the passages that reference his disdain for possessions and for money, those are most likely the historical ones. The most famous of these sayings, found in all 3 of the synoptics, is the one where Jesus says that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Simultaneously dissing rich people and making generations of large church pastors spin like tops trying to explain it away, pretending that Jesus didn't mean exactly what he said, and said with the emphasis of an exaggerated image. But there are also interesting and more subtle examples in the Gospels, such as the fact that Judas was probably not a real person. Judas was a literary creation to represent all of Judah. But in the character that the gospel writers created, they made Judas the one who carried the common purse. Just guilt by association, that he's the one that had money in his possession, and he's the one that probably, the implication being that he stole, that he was greedy, that he was a person that couldn't be trusted, right up to the end where he exchanged his beloved Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. I also like the fact that when Jesus was asked about paying taxes to Rome, he not only told them to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to give to God what is God's, he had to ask someone to show him a coin. Why would he have to ask? Because he didn't have one. Jesus didn't carry money. He evidently never touched the stuff. And in an account that's probably entirely apocryphal, in the 17th chapter of Matthew, Jesus is asked about paying the temple tax. He's asked, don't you and your disciples pay the temple tax? The tithe that churches like to talk about, the tithe was actually a taxation for social welfare. It was a welfare tax. The 10% that you paid out of your income was to support those who were in need. But the temple itself was supported by a temple tax. And so Jesus says to Peter, go throw a fishing line in the lake, and the first fish that you catch will have a 4 drachma coin in his mouth. Now, this is a story that most of you probably don't even remember. It's right there in the 17th chapter of Matthew, but the story is so ridiculous, it's so preposterous, that it tends never to be mentioned in church. You virtually would never have heard a sermon about it because it's embarrassingly obvious that it isn't true, that it was made up. But the bigger question is, why would the gospel writer, Matthew in this case, make up a story that's so obviously fake on the face of it? Matthew wanted to drive home the point that Jesus' indifference towards money was so profound that he didn't have any, he didn't need any, he didn't want any, and even when put on the spot to pay a tax to the temple, he avoided the whole issue by performing a miracle of finding a coin in a fish's mouth. That he wanted to be kept as distant from the issue of money as possible. Now, the story's fake, but it's a story that's intended to undergird the historical memory of Jesus as a person who completely eschewed having things, owning things, or having money. The Gospels portray Jesus as being so free of possessions that even at one point he says to a potential disciple that he is literally more poor than a fox that has a den to sleep in or a bird that has a nest to sleep in, because he literally has no place to lay his head at night. That saying inspired centuries of ascetic monks taking a vow of poverty and trying their best to live with absolutely nothing. Now, I've known a lot of monks through the years. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on monastic spirituality. I have lived in monastic houses for short periods of time while I was doing my doctoral research and since. In fact, Sean and I will be staying at the Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky next week. I admire the lives of the brothers who have pledged themselves to this very simple life. Still, it deserves to be said that they were hardly a fox with a den or a bird with a nest. They live in a big house. They have their own room. They are assured food in the refectory every day. They are even assured medical care in their own infirmary that's on the grounds and a place in which to retire in community. I assure you, though, you still wouldn't want to trade your middle-class home for that monk's cell, nor would you relish the vegetarian diet that they maintain, not to mention their habit of rising for corporate prayer at 3:15 every morning and coming back for Mass at 6. Sorry, Sean, I hadn't mentioned that to you, but I'll meet you there. Trappists observe a general rule of silence. Since Vatican II, it's no longer a vow of silence, but it's considered a courtesy to one another that they just don't talk unnecessarily. And quite frankly, anything that you might be inclined to say at 3 o'clock in the morning after that bell rings again doesn't really bear repetition in a religious house. But the brothers have neither a spouse nor children. They do not worry about passing along family heirlooms to another generation or about making sure that their grandchildren get an education. Even Jesus, as he's portrayed in Scripture, did not have a spouse or children. Now, Historically, you might want to debate that. There's a credible case to be made that Jesus may have been married and had a family, but at least the way the gospel writers portray him, he had nothing. Still, even in that state, he depended upon the generosity of others to give him a place to sleep and something to eat. The extremity of the moral rejection of money and possessions in the Gospels, and the remarkable example that's set for all of us, even in modern days, by monks who embrace a life of poverty and chastity, these stand at the other end of the spectrum from the messages that we are bombarded with every day. I challenge you to take a Sunday paper. Just pick up the whole of a Sunday paper in all of its thousands of pieces of paper, and then pull out all the advertisements and set them to one side and look at how much news there is and how much advertisement there is. I did that to the Sunday paper this morning. There was 3 times as much advertisement as there was news text. We are pounded daily, minute by minute, with internet pop-ups, with magazine articles, with newspaper advertisements, with ads on the radio, with junk mail in our mailbox, and filling all of our media with advertisements. Now, even in ancient times, people had a natural appetite for nicer things. You look at what's in museums that's discovered from archaeological digs. They clearly had an appetite for jewelry, for fine pottery, for comfortable furniture, and a larger and safer house. But modernity has taken that natural appetite and coated it with cocaine. We are literally addicted to our consumer culture, to get bigger, to get more, to have nicer, more attractive, more comfortable, more ego-enhancing automobiles, something that pleases our senses more in our decorations, in our dining out, in our clothes, our shoes, our vacations. The mere presence of the lottery in virtually every convenience store and gas station in our country speaks to our fantasy that we might be unimaginably rich, and our greed for possessions spawned an entire reality TV universe about hoarding and storage lockers and treasure hunts. We can easily say that the cases of hoarding that we see on TV, and that many of us have seen in our families or in our neighbors, it's easy to say that that is sick in its extreme. When we see someone who is much worse off than we are, we may tend to breathe a sigh of relief, and I think that's a lot of the popularity of those shows. But I can tell you, while the people on that end of the spectrum may have the flu, all of us have a fever. All of us have some infection of the consumer culture that's in our lives. During my brief stint as a hospice chaplain, when I was going into the homes of several patients in their last months of life, I was blown away by how many of them had their houses literally stacked floor to ceiling with stuff. So much so that at the end of the day, I would regularly decompress from that experience by going through my own home, opening every closet door, pulling out every drawer, opening every cabinet, until I could fill up my dumpster with stuff that I really didn't need to keep. I suspect that everyone here today could go home and in an hour's time fill your dumpster with things that you have stored that you have not used for years and that you will never use again. There's just something difficult, though, about giving something away or throwing something away that you have paid for, or that you're used to seeing, or that you inherited, things that start to literally own you. I spend so little time at my home that I could easily downsize to a house half the size of my current home. And I don't live in a very big house, but I could easily live in half as much space as I have, but I don't know what I'd do with all my stuff. When my parents moved into a retirement home, they distributed their antiques to their children, and now I've got several of them in my house. And when I think about downsizing, I start wondering, would my daughter be willing to take these things off my hand? I am prepared to do to her what was done to me, where you're obligated to have a bigger house to hold on to things that maybe you never needed in the first place. An honest read of the Gospels asks us all to make a conscious decision to take control of our appetites, to not give in to the constant drumbeat of TV commercials and magazine ads and internet pop-ups and the product placement in movies. We need to, for both economic and environmental reasons, to be aware of how we live, how we consume, because the way we live and the way we consume can create hunger and poverty at the other end of the spectrum. In that sense, we have to be a lot smarter than those first century Palestinians who literally couldn't have hurt the earth much if they wanted to. One of the worst things that they could do to an enemy is to pour salt on their field. We can destroy our environment, possibly nearly permanently, through the way that we consume. And I'm not talking just about burning coal and gasoline, fossil fuels, and exhausting limited resources. Simply by our choice to consume so much beef in America, we are creating an environmental hazard. I was one of those people that leased an electric car for a couple of years. I would love to be able to buy one of the new Teslas that are being produced. I hate burning gasoline, either to cut my grass or to drive my car. But the fact is that methane produced from cows in the United States is doing more damage to our environment than the exhaust from all of the automobiles on the road. Learning to consume less, specifically of the things that damage the environment, to conserve energy, to eat with a greater awareness of how our choices affect the planet and can create hunger in other nations or in our own, that's part of what it means to lead a spiritual life, to simply be aware that if we eat more grain and less meat, there is more food for other people to eat. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone here try to live like Jesus. We may not be made of the stuff of a Mother Teresa or of a Jesus or of a Trappist monk. I'm just saying that we need to be aware that they did set that example, and that you would think that their choice is extreme, but you look at the other end of the spectrum and you know that the whole hoarding, consuming, saving, acquiring, that is sick. You wouldn't hesitate for a moment to call that sick. So the question is, how healthy do we want to be? If that's a spectrum between a Trappist monk and a hoarder, where do you want to be in that line? How free do you want to be in your life? How deep into the consumer culture would you like to be buried and owned? Because we can choose to live more freely, more conscientiously, and to give resources and food and opportunity to others. Now, that isn't about guilt. It's more about health. It isn't about a religious obligation. It's about finding a sane balance that allows you to have a decent life while leaving enough of the world's goods for everybody else to have a decent life. The coat hanging in your closet today that you will never wear belongs to someone who doesn't have one. The shoes that you have in your closet that you do not need belong to someone who has no shoes. The air that is fouled by the grain and water you waste to eat your next hamburger very well could belong to a person who's simply waiting for a breath of fresh air, a drink of clean water, and bread to eat. All I'm asking you to do is to conscientiously take charge of your own choices and stop letting advertisements make the choices for you.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.